Chapter 9. Doc has a misadventure. "The war will not be over before next spring now," said Dr. Blythe when it became apparent that the long battle of the Aisne had resulted in a stalemate. Rilla was murmuring "knit 4, purl 1" under her breath and rocking the baby's cradle with one foot. Morgan disapproved of cradles for babies, but Susan did not, and it was worth while to take some slight sacrifice of principle to keep Susan in good humour. She laid down her knitting for a moment and said, "Oh, how can we bear it so long?" then picked up her sock and went on. The Rilla of 2 months before would have rushed off to Rainbow Valley and cried. Miss Oliver sighed and Mrs. Blythe clasped her hands for a moment. Then Susan said briskly, "Well, we must just gird up our loins and pitch in. Business as usual is England's motto, they tell me, Mrs. Dr. dear, and I have taken it for mine, not thinking I could easily find a better. I shall make the same kind of pudding today I always make on Saturday. It is a good deal of trouble to make, and that is well, for it will employ my thoughts. I will remember that Kitchener is at the helm and Joffer is doing very well for a Frenchman. I shall get that box of cake off to little Jem and finish that pair of socks today likewise. A sock a day is my allowance. Old Mrs. Albert Mead of Harbour Head manages a pair and a half a day, but she has nothing to do but knit. You know, Mrs. Dr. dear, she has been bedrid for years and has been worrying terrible because she was no good to anybody and a dreadful expense, and yet could not die and be out of the way, and now they tell me she is quite chirked up and resigned to living because there is something she can do, and she knits for the soldiers from daylight to dark. Even Cousin Sophia has taken to knitting, Mrs. Dr. dear, and it is a good thing, for she cannot think of quite so many doleful speeches to make when her hands are busy with her needles instead of being folded on her stomach. She thinks we will all be Germans this time next year, but I tell her it will take more than a year to make a German out of me. Do you know that Rick McAllister is enlisted, Mrs. Dr. dear? And they say Joe Milgrave would too, only he is afraid that if he does that Whiskers on the moon will not let him have Miranda. Whiskers says that he will believe the stories of German atrocities when he sees them, and that it is a good thing that Rangs Cathedral has been destroyed because it was a Roman Catholic church. Now, I am not a Roman Catholic, Mrs. Dr. dear, being born and bred a good Presbyterian and meaning to live and die one, but I maintain that the Catholics have as good a right to their churches as we have to ours, and that the Huns had no kind of business to destroy them. Just think, Mrs. Dr. dear," concluded Susan pathetically, "how we would feel if a German shell knocked down the spire of our church here in the Glen, and I'm sure it is every bit as bad to think of Rangs Cathedral being hammered to pieces." And meanwhile, everywhere, the lads of the world, rich and poor, low and high, white and brown, were following the Piper's call. "Even Billy Andrews' boy is going, and Jane's only son, and Diana's little Jack," said Mrs. Blythe. "Priscilla's son is gone from Japan, and Stella's from Vancouver, and both the Reverend Joe's boys. Philippa writes that her boys went right away, not being afflicted with her indecision. Jem says that he thinks they will be leaving very soon now, and that he will not be able to get leave to come so far before they go, as they will have to start at a few hours' notice," said the doctor, passing the letter to his wife. "That is not fair," said Susan indignantly. "Has Sir Sam Hughes no regard for our feelings? The idea of whisking that blessed boy away to Europe without letting us even have a last glimpse of him! If I were you, Dr. dear, I would write to the papers about it." "Perhaps it is as well," said the disappointed mother. "I don't believe I could bear another parting from him, now that I know the war will not be over as soon as we hoped when he left first. Oh, if only but no, I won't say it. Like Susan and Rilla," concluded Mrs. Blythe, achieving a laugh, "I am determined to be a heroine." "You're all good stuff," said the doctor. "I'm proud of my women folk. Even Rilla here, my lily of the field, is running a Red Cross society full blast and saving a little life for Canada. That's a good piece of work. Rilla, daughter of Anne, what are you going to call your war baby?" "I'm waiting to hear from Jim Anderson," said Rilla. "He may want to name his own child." But as the autumn weeks went by, no word came from Jim Anderson, who had never been heard from since he sailed from Halifax, and to whom the fate of wife and child seemed a matter of indifference. Eventually Rilla decided to call the baby James, and Susan opined that Kitchener should be added there too. So James Kitchener Anderson became the possessor of a name somewhat more imposing than himself. The Ingleside family promptly shortened it to Jims, but Susan obstinately called him Little Kitchener and nothing else. "Jims is no name for a Christian child, Mrs. Dr. dear," she said disapprovingly. "Cousin Sophia says it is too flippant, and for once I consider she utters sense, though I would not please her by openly agreeing with her. As for the child, he is beginning to look something like a baby, and I must admit that Rilla is wonderful with him, though I would not pamper pride by saying so to her face. Mrs. Dr. dear, I shall never, no, never forget the first sight I had of that infant lying in that big soup tureen, rolled up in dirty flannel. It is not often that Susan Baker is flabbergasted, but flabbergasted I was then, and that you may tie to. For one awful moment I thought my mind had given way and that I was seeing visions. Then thinks I, no, I never heard of anyone having a vision of a soup tureen, so it must be real at least. And I plucked up confidence. When I heard the doctor tell Rilla that she must take care of the baby, I thought he was joking, for I did not believe for a minute she would or could do it. But you see what has happened, and it is making a woman of her. When we have to do a thing, Mrs. Dr. dear, we can do it." Susan added another proof to this concluding dictum of hers one day in October. The doctor and his wife were away. Rilla was presiding over Jim's afternoon siesta upstairs, purling 4 and knitting 1 with ceaseless vim. Susan was seated on the back veranda, shelling beans, and Cousin Sophia was helping her. Peace and tranquillity brooded over the glen. The sky was fleeced over with silvery, shining clouds. Rainbow Valley lay in a soft autumnal haze of fairy purple. The maple grove was a burning bush of colour, and the hedge of sweetbriar around the kitchen yard was a thing of wonder in its subtle tintings. It did not seem that strife could be in the world, and Susan's faithful heart was lulled into a brief forgetfulness, although she had lain awake most of the preceding night thinking of little Jem far out on the Atlantic, where the great fleet was carrying Canada's first army across the ocean. Even Cousin Sophia looked less melancholy than usual, and admitted that there was not much fault to be found in the day, although there was no doubt it was a weather breeder and there would be an awful storm on its heels. "Things is too calm to last," she said. As if in confirmation of her assertion, a most unearthly din suddenly arose behind them. It was quite impossible to describe the confused medley of bangs and rattles and muffled shrieks and yowls that proceeded from the kitchen, accompanied by occasional crashes. Susan and Cousin Sophia stared at each other in dismay. "What upon airth has bruck loose in there?" gasped Cousin Sophia. "It must be that Hyde cat gone clean mad at last," muttered Susan. "I have always expected it." Rilla came flying out of the side door of the living room. "What has happened?" she demanded. "It is beyond me to say, but that possessed beast of yours is evidently at the bottom of it," said Susan. "Do not go near him, at least. I will open the door and peep in. There goes some more of the crockery. I have always said that the devil was in him, and that I will tie to." "It is my opinion that the cat has hydrophobia," said Cousin Sophia solemnly. "I once heard of a cat that went mad and bit 3 people, and they all died a most terrible death, and turned black as ink." Undismayed by this, Susan opened the door and looked in. The floor was littered with fragments of broken dishes, for it seemed that the fatal tragedy had taken place on the long dresser where Susan's array of cooking bowls had been marshalled in shining state. Around the kitchen tore a frantic cat, with his head wedged tightly in an old salmon can. Blindly he careered about with shrieks and profanity commingled, now banging the can madly against anything he encountered, now trying vainly to wrench it off with his paws. The sight was so funny that Rilla doubled up with laughter. Susan looked at her reproachfully. "I see nothing to laugh at. That beast has broken your ma's big blue mixing bowl that she brought from Green Gables when she was married. That is no small calamity in my opinion. But the thing to consider now is how to get that can off Hyde's head." "Don't you dast go touching it," exclaimed Cousin Sophia, galvanized into animation. "It might be your death. Shut the kitchen up and send for Albert." "I am not in the habit of sending for Albert during family difficulties," said Susan loftily. "That beast is in torment, and whatever my opinion of him may be, I cannot endure to see him suffering pain. You keep away, Rilla, for little Kitchener's sake, and I will see what I can do." Susan stalked undauntedly into the kitchen, seized an old storm coat of the doctor's, and after a wild pursuit and several fruitless dashes and pounces, managed to throw it over the cat and can. Then she proceeded to saw the can loose with a can opener, while Rilla held the squirming animal rolled in the coat. Anything like Doc's shrieks while the process was going on was never heard at Ingleside. Susan was in mortal dread that the Albert Crawfords would hear it and conclude she was torturing the creature to death. Doc was a wrathful and indignant cat when he was freed. Evidently he thought the whole thing was a put-up job to bring him low. He gave Susan a baleful glance by way of gratitude, and rushed out of the kitchen to take sanctuary in the jungle of the sweetbriar hedge, where he sulked for the rest of the day. Susan swept up her broken dishes grimly. "The Huns themselves couldn't have worked more havoc here," she said bitterly. "But when people will keep a satanic animal like that, in spite of all warnings, they cannot complain when their wedding bowls get broken. Things have come to a pretty pass when an honest woman cannot leave her kitchen for a few minutes without a fiend of a cat rampaging through it with his head in a salmon can." Chapter 10. The Troubles of Rilla. October passed out and the dreary days of November and December dragged by. The world shook with the thunder of contending armies. Antwerp fell. Turkey declared war. Gallant little Serbia gathered herself together and struck a deadly blow at her oppressor. And in quiet, hill-girdled Glen St. Mary, thousands of miles away, hearts beat with hope and fear over the varying dispatches from day to day. "A few months ago," said Miss Oliver, "we thought and talked in terms of Glen St. Mary. Now we think and talk in terms of military tactics and diplomatic intrigue. There was just one great event every day, the coming of the mail. Even Susan admitted that from the time the mail carrier's buggy rumbled over the little bridge between the station and the village until the papers were brought home and read, she could not work properly. "I must take up my knitting then, and knit hard till the papers come, Mrs. Dr. dear. Knitting is something you can do even when your heart is going like a trip hammer and the pit of your stomach feels all gone and your thoughts are catawampus. Then, when I see the headlines, be they good or be they bad, I calm down and am able to go about my business again. It is an unfortunate thing that the mail comes in just when our dinner rush is on, and I think the government could arrange things better. But the drive on Calais has failed, as I felt perfectly sure it would, and the Kaiser will not eat his Christmas dinner in London this year. Do you know, Mrs. Dr. dear," Susan's voice lowered as a token that she was going to impart a very shocking piece of information, "I have been told on good authority, or else you may be sure I would not be repeating it when it concerns a minister, that the Reverend Dr. Arnold goes to Charlottetown every week and takes a Turkish bath for his rheumatism. The idea of him doing that when we were at war with Turkey! One of his own deacons has always insisted that Mr. Arnold's theology was not sound, and I am beginning to believe that there is some reason to fear it. Well, I must bestir myself this afternoon and get little Jem's Christmas cake packed up for him. He will enjoy it if the blessed boy is not drowned in mud before that time." Jem was in camp on Salisbury Plain, and was writing gay, cheery letters home in spite of the mud. Walter was at Redmond, and his letters to Rilla were anything but cheerful. She never opened one without a dread tugging at her heart that it would tell her he had enlisted. His unhappiness made her unhappy. She wanted to put her arm around him and comfort him, as she had done that day in Rainbow Valley. She hated everybody who was responsible for Walter's unhappiness. "He will go yet," she murmured miserably to herself one afternoon, as she sat alone in Rainbow Valley, reading a letter from him. "He will go yet, and if he does I just can't bear it." Walter wrote that someone had sent him an envelope containing a white feather. "I deserved it, Rilla. I felt that I ought to put it on and wear it, proclaiming myself to all Redmond the coward I know I am. The boys of my year are going. Every day 2 or 3 of them join up. Some days I almost make up my mind to do it, and then I see myself thrusting a bayonet through another man, some woman's husband or sweetheart or son, perhaps the father of little children. I see myself lying alone, torn and mangled, burning with thirst on a cold, wet field, surrounded by dead and dying men, and I know I never can. I can't face even the thought of it. How could I face the reality? There are times when I wish I had never been born. Life has always seemed such a beautiful thing to me, and now it is a hideous thing. Rilla, my Rilla, if it weren't for your letters, your dear, bright, merry, funny, comical, believing letters, I think I'd give up. And Una's. Una is really a little brick, isn't she? There's a wonderful fineness and firmness under all that shy, wistful girlishness of her. She hasn't your knack of writing laugh-provoking epistles, but there's something in her letters, I don't know what, that makes me feel, at least while I'm reading them, that I could even go to the front. Not that she ever says a word about my going, or hints that I ought to go. She isn't that kind. It's just the spirit of them, the personality that is in them. Well, I can't go. You have a brother, and Una has a friend who is a coward." "Oh, I wish Walter wouldn't write such things," sighed Rilla. "It hurts me. He isn't a coward. He isn't. He isn't." She looked wistfully about her, at the little woodland valley and the grey, lonely fallows beyond. How everything reminded her of Walter. The red leaves still clung to the wild sweetbriars that overhung a curve of the brook. Their stems were gemmed with the pearls of the gentle rain that had fallen a little while before. Walter had once written a poem describing them. The wind was sighing and rustling among the frosted brown bracken ferns, then lessening sorrowfully away down the brook. Walter had said once that he loved the melancholy of the autumn wind on a November day. The old tree lovers still clasped each other in a faithful embrace, and the White Lady, now a great white-branched tree, stood out beautifully fine against the grey velvet sky. Walter had named them long ago, and last November, when he had walked with her and Miss Oliver in the valley, he had said, looking at the leafless lady, with a young silver moon hanging over her, "A white birch is a beautiful pagan maiden who has never lost the Eden secret of being naked and unashamed." Miss Oliver had said, "Put that into a poem, Walter," and he had done so and read it to them the next day, just a short thing with goblin imagination in every line of it. Oh, how happy they had been then. Well, Rilla scrambled to her feet. Time was up. Jims would soon be awake. His lunch had to be prepared. His little slips had to be ironed. There was a committee meeting of the Junior Reds that night. There was her new knitting bag to finish. It would be the handsomest bag in the Junior Society, handsomer even than Irene Howard's. She must get home and get to work. She was busy these days from morning till night. That little monkey of a Jim's took so much time. But he was growing. He was certainly growing. And there were times when Rilla felt sure that it was not merely a pious hope but an absolute fact that he was getting decidedly better looking. Sometimes she felt quite proud of him, and sometimes she yearned to spank him, but she never kissed him or wanted to kiss him. "The Germans captured Lodz today," said Miss Oliver one December evening when she, Mrs. Blythe and Susan were busy sewing or knitting in the cosy living room. "This war is at least extending my knowledge of geography. Schoolma'am though I am, 3 months ago I didn't know there was such a place in the world such as Lodz. Had I heard it mentioned I would have known nothing about it and cared as little. I know all about it now. Its size, its standing, its military significance. Yesterday the news that the Germans have captured it in their second rush to Warsaw made my heart sink into my boots. I woke up in the night and worried over it. I don't wonder babies always cry when they wake up in the night. Everything presses on my soul then, and no cloud has a silver lining." "When I wake up in the night and cannot go to sleep again," remarked Susan, who was knitting and reading at the same time, "I pass the moments by torturing the Kaiser to death. Last night I fried him in boiling oil, and a great comfort it was to me, remembering those Belgian babies." "If the Kaiser were here and had a pain in his shoulder, you'd be the first to run for the liniment bottle to rub him down," laughed Miss Oliver. "Would I?" cried outraged Susan. "Would I, Miss Oliver? I would rub him down with coal oil, Miss Oliver, and leave it to blister. That is what I would do, and that you may tie to. A pain in his shoulder, indeed. He will have pains all over him before he is through with what he has started." "We are told to love our enemies, Susan," said the doctor solemnly. "Yes, our enemies, but not King George's enemies, doctor dear," retorted Susan crushingly. She was so well pleased with herself over this flattening out of the doctor completely that she even smiled as she polished her glasses. Susan had never given in to glasses before, but she had done so at last in order to be able to read the war news, and not a dispatch got by her. "Can you tell me, Miss Oliver, how to pronounce MLAWA and BZURA and PRZEMYSL? That last is a conundrum which nobody seems to have solved yet, Susan, and I can make only a guess at the others." "These foreign names are far from being decent, in my opinion," said disgusted Susan. "I dare say the Austrians and Russians would think Saskatchewan and Musquodoboit about as bad, Susan," said Miss Oliver. "The Serbians have done wonderfully of late. They have captured Belgrade." "And sent the Austrian creatures packing across the Danube with a flea in their ear," said Susan with a relish, as she settled down to examine a map of Eastern Europe, prodding each locality with the knitting needle to brand it on her memory. "Cousin Sophia said a while ago that Serbia was done for, but I told her there was still such a thing as an overruling providence, doubt it who might. It says here that the slaughter was terrible. For all they were foreigners, it is awful to think of so many men being killed, Mrs. Dr. dear, for they are scarce enough as it is." Rilla was upstairs, relieving her overcharged feelings by writing in her diary. "Things have all gone catawampus, as Susan says, with me this week. Part of it was my own fault and part of it wasn't, and I seem to be equally unhappy over both parts. I went to town the other day to buy a new winter hat. It was the first time nobody insisted on coming with me to help me select it, and I felt that Mother had really given up thinking of me as a child. And I found the dearest hat. It was simply bewitching. It was a velvet hat of the very shade of rich green that was made for me. It just goes with my hair and complexion beautifully, bringing out the red-brown shades and what Miss Oliver calls my creaminess so well. Only once before in my life have I come across that precise shade of green. When I was 12 I had a little beaver hat of it, and all the girls in school were wild over it. Well, as soon as I saw this hat I felt that I simply must have it, and have it I did. The price was dreadful. I will not put it down here because I don't want my descendants to know I was guilty of paying so much for a hat, in wartime too, when everybody is, or should be, trying to be economical. When I got home and tried on the hat again in my room I was assailed by qualms. Of course it was very becoming, but somehow it seemed too elaborate and fussy for church going and our quiet little doings in the glen. Too conspicuous, in short. It hadn't seemed so at the milliner's, but here in my little white room it did. And that dreadful price tag. And the starving Belgians. When Mother saw the hat and the tag she just looked at me. Mother is some expert at looking. Father says she looked him into love with her years ago in Avonlea school, and I can well believe it, though I have heard a weird tale of her banging him over the head with a slate at the very beginning of their acquaintance. Mother was a limb when she was a little girl, I understand, and even up to the time when Jem went away she was full of ginger. But let me return to my mutton, that is to say, my new green velvet hat. "Do you think, Rilla," Mother said quietly, far too quietly, "that it was right to spend so much for a hat, especially when the need of the world is so great?" "I paid for it out of my own allowance, Mother," I exclaimed. "That is not the point. Your allowance is based on the principle of a reasonable amount for each thing you need. If you pay too much for one thing, you must cut off somewhere else, and that is not satisfactory. But if you think you did right, Rilla, I have no more to say. I leave it to your conscience." I wish Mother would not leave things to my conscience. And anyway, what was I to do? I couldn't take that hat back. I'd worn it to a concert in town. I had to keep it. I was so uncomfortable that I flew into a temper, a cold, calm, deadly temper. "Mother," I said haughtily, "I am sorry you disapprove of my hat." "Not of the hat exactly," said Mother, "though I consider it in doubtful taste for so young a girl, but of the price you paid for it." Being interrupted didn't improve my temper, so I went on, colder and calmer and deadlier than ever, just as if Mother had not spoken. "But I have to keep it now. However, I promise you that I will not get another hat for 3 years or for the duration of the war, if it lasts longer than that. Even you," oh, the sarcasm I put into the "you," "cannot say that what I paid was too much when spread over at least 3 years." "You will be very tired of that hat before 3 years, Rilla," said Mother with a provoking grin, which, being interpreted, meant that I wouldn't stick it out. "Tired or not, I will wear it that long," I said, and then I marched upstairs and cried to think that I had been sarcastic to Mother. I hate that hat already. "But 3 years or the duration of the war," I said, "and 3 years or the duration of the war it shall be. I vowed, and I shall keep my vow, cost what it will." That is one of the catawampus things. The other is that I have quarrelled with Irene Howard. Or she quarrelled with me, or... no, we both quarrelled. The Junior Red Cross met here yesterday. The hour of meeting was 2:30, but Irene came at 1:30 because she got the chance of a drive down from the Upper Glen. Irene hasn't been a bit nice to me since the fuss about the Eads, and besides I feel sure she resents not being president. But I have been determined that things should go smoothly, so I have never taken any notice, and when she came yesterday she seemed so nice and sweet again that I hoped she had got over her huffiness and we could be the chums we used to be. But as soon as we sat down Irene began to rub me the wrong way. I saw her cast a look at my new knitting bag. All the girls have always said Irene was jealous-minded, and I would never believe them before, but now I feel that perhaps she is. The first thing she did was to pounce on Jims. Irene pretends to adore babies. Pick him out of his cradle and kiss him all over his face. Now Irene knows perfectly well that I don't like to have Jims kissed like that. It is not hygienic. After she had worried him till he began to fuss, she looked at me and gave me quite a nasty little laugh, but she said, oh so sweetly, "Why, Rilla, darling, you look as if you thought I was poisoning the baby." "Oh no, I don't, Irene," I said, every bit as sweetly, "but you know Morgan says that the only place a baby should be kissed is on its forehead for fear of germs, and that is my rule with Jims." "Dear me, am I so full of germs?" said Irene plaintively. I knew she was making fun of me and I began to boil inside, but outside no sign of a simmer. I was determined I would not scrap with Irene. Then she began to bounce Jims. Now Morgan says that bouncing is almost the worst thing that can be done to a baby. I never allow Jims to be bounced, but Irene bounced him and that exasperating child liked it. He smiled for the very first time. He is 4 months old and he has never smiled once before. Not even Mother or Susan have been able to coax that thing to smile, try as they would, and here he was smiling because Irene Howard bounced him. Talk of gratitude. I admit that smile made a big difference in him. 2 of the dearest dimples came out in his cheeks and his big brown eyes seemed full of laughter. The way Irene raved over those dimples was silly, I consider. You would have supposed she thought she had really brought them into existence. But I sewed steadily and did not enthuse, and soon Irene got tired of bouncing Jims and put him back in his cradle. He did not like that after being played with, and he began to cry and was fussy the rest of the afternoon, whereas if Irene had only left him alone he would not have been a bit of trouble. Irene looked at him and said, "Does he often cry like that?" as if she had never heard a baby crying before. I explained patiently that children have to cry so many minutes per day in order to expand their lungs. Morgan says so. If Jims didn't cry at all, I'd have to make him cry for at least 20 minutes, I said. "Oh, indeed," said Irene, laughing as if she didn't believe me. Morgan on the care of infants was upstairs, or I would soon have convinced her. Then she said Jims didn't have much hair. She had never seen a 4-month-old baby so bald. Of course I knew Jims hadn't much hair yet, but Irene said it in a tone that seemed to imply it was my fault that he hadn't any hair. I said I had seen dozens of babies every bit as bald as Jims, and Irene said, oh, very well, she hadn't meant to offend me, when I wasn't offended. It went on like that the rest of the hour. Irene kept giving me little digs all the time. The girls have always said she was revengeful like that if she were peeved about anything, but I never believed it before. I used to think Irene just perfect, and it hurt me dreadfully to find she could stoop to this. But I corked up my feelings and sewed away for dear life on a Belgian child's nightgown. Then Irene told me the meanest, most contemptible thing that someone had said about Walter. I won't write it down. I can't. Of course, she said it made her furious to hear it and all that. But there was no need for her to tell me such a thing even if she did hear it. She simply did it to hurt me. I just exploded. "How dare you come here and repeat such a thing about my brother, Irene Howard?" I exclaimed. "I shall never forgive you. Never! Your brother hasn't enlisted, hasn't any idea of enlisting." "Why, Rilla, dear, I didn't say it," said Irene. "I told you it was Mrs. George Burr, and I told her—" "I don't want to hear what you told her. Don't you ever speak to me again, Irene Howard." Of course, I shouldn't have said that. But it just seemed to say itself. Then the other girls all came in a bunch and I had to calm down and act the hostess part as well as I could. Irene paired off with Olive Kirk all the rest of the afternoon and went away without so much as a look. So I suppose she means to take me at my word, and I don't care, for I do not want to be friends with a girl who could repeat such a falsehood about Walter. But I feel unhappy over it for all that. We've always been such good chums, and until lately Irene was lovely to me. And now another illusion has been stripped from my eyes, and I feel as if there wasn't such a thing as real, true friendship in the world. Father got old Joe Mead to build a kennel for Dog Monday in the corner of the shipping shed today. We thought perhaps Monday would come home when the cold weather came, but he wouldn't. No earthly influence can coax Monday away from that shed even for a few minutes. There he stays and meets every train. So we had to do something to make him comfortable. Joe built the kennel so that Monday could lie in it and still see the platform, so we hope he will occupy it. Monday has become quite famous. A reporter of the Enterprise came out from town and photographed him and wrote up the whole story of his faithful vigil. It was published in the Enterprise and copied all over Canada. But that doesn't matter to poor little Monday. Jem has gone away. Monday doesn't know where or why, but he will wait until he comes back. Somehow it comforts me. It's foolish, I suppose, but it gives me a feeling that Jem will come back, or else Monday wouldn't keep on waiting for him. Jims is snoring beside me in his cradle. It is just a cold that makes him snore, not adenoids. Irene had a cold yesterday, and I know she gave it to him, kissing him. He is not quite such a nuisance as he was. He has got some backbone and can sit up quite nicely, and he loves his bath now and splashes unsmilingly in the water instead of twisting and shrieking. Oh, shall I ever forget those first 2 months? I don't know how I lived through them. But here I am, and here is Jims, and we both are going to carry on. I tickled him a little bit tonight when I undressed him. I wouldn't bounce him, but Morgan doesn't mention tickling, just to see if he would smile for me as well as Irene. And he did, and out popped the dimples. What a pity his mother couldn't have seen them. I finished my 6th pair of socks today. With the first 3 I got Susan to set the heel for me. Then I thought that was a bit of shirking, so I learned to do it myself. I hate it, but I have done so many things I hate since 4th of August that one more or less doesn't matter. I just think of Jem joking about the mud on Salisbury Plain and I go at them. Chapter 11. Dark and Bright. At Christmas the college boys and girls came home, and for a little while Ingleside was gay again. But all were not there. For the first time one was missing from the circle round the Christmas table. Jem of the steady lips and fearless eyes was far away, and Rilla felt that the sight of his vacant chair was more than she could endure. Susan had taken a stubborn freak and insisted on setting out Jem's place for him as usual, with the twisted little napkin ring he had always had since a boy, and the odd high Green Gables goblet that Aunt Marilla had once given him, and from which he always insisted on drinking. "That blessed boy shall have his place, Mrs. Doctor dear," said Susan firmly, "and do not you feel over it, for you may be sure he is here in spirit, and next Christmas he will be here in the body. Wait you till the big push comes in the spring, and the war will be over in a jiffy." They tried to think so, but a shadow stalked in the background of their determined merrymaking. Walter, too, was quiet and dull all through the holidays. He showed Rilla a cruel, anonymous letter he had received at Redmond, a letter far more conspicuous for malice than for patriotic indignation. Nevertheless, all it says is true, Rilla. Rilla had caught it from him and thrown it into the fire. "There isn't one word of truth in it," she declared hotly. "Walter, you've got morbid, as Miss Oliver says she gets when she broods too long over one thing." "I can't get away from it at Redmond, Rilla. The whole college is aflame over the war. A perfectly fit fellow of military age who doesn't join up is looked upon as a shirker and treated accordingly. Dr. Milne, the English professor who has always made a special pet of me, has 2 sons in khaki, and I can feel the change in his manner towards me. It's not fair. You're not fit." "Physically I am, sound as a bell. The unfitness is in the soul, and it's a taint and a disgrace. There, don't cry, Rilla. I'm not going, if that's what you're afraid of. The Piper's music rings in my ears day and night, but I cannot follow." "You would break Mother's heart and mine if you did," sobbed Rilla. "Oh, Walter, one is enough for any family." The holidays were an unhappy time for her. Still, having Nan and Di and Walter and Shirley home helped in the enduring of things. A letter and book came for her from Kenneth Ford, too. Some sentences in the letter made her cheeks burn and her heart beat, until the last paragraph, which sent an icy chill over everything. My ankle is about as good as new. I'll be fit to join up in a couple of months more, Rilla, my Rilla. It will be some feeling to get into khaki all right. Little Ken will be able to look the whole world in the face then and owe not any man. It's been rotten lately since I've been able to walk without limping. People who don't know look at me as much as to say slacker. Well, they won't have the chance to look it much longer. I hate this war, said Rilla bitterly, as she gazed out into the maple grove that was a chill glory of pink and gold in the winter sunset. 1914 has gone, said Dr. Blythe on New Year's Day. Its sun, which rose fairly, has set in blood. What will 1915 bring? Victory, said Susan, for once laconic. Do you really believe we'll win the war, Susan? Said Miss Oliver drearily. She had come over from Lowbridge to spend the day and see Walter and the girls before they went back to Redmond. She was in a rather blue and cynical mood and inclined to look on the dark side. Believe we'll win the war? Exclaimed Susan. No, Miss Oliver, dear, I do not believe. I know. That does not worry me. What does worry me is the trouble and expense of it all. But then you cannot make omelettes without breaking eggs, so we must just trust in God and make big guns. Sometimes I think the big guns are better to trust in than God, said Miss Oliver defiantly. No, no, dear, you do not. The Germans had the big guns at the Marne, had they not? But Providence settled them. Do not ever forget that. Just hold on to that when you feel inclined to doubt. Clutch hold of the sides of your chair and sit tight and keep saying, big guns are good, but the Almighty is better, and He is on our side, no matter what the Kaiser says about it. I would have gone crazy many a day lately, Miss Oliver, dear, if I had not sat tight and repeated that to myself. My cousin Sophia is, like you, somewhat inclined to despond. Oh, dear me, what will we do if the Germans ever get here? She wailed to me yesterday. Bury them, said I, just as offhand as that. There's plenty of room for the graves. Cousin Sophia said that I was flippant, but I was not flippant, Miss Oliver dear, only calm and confident in the British Navy and our Canadian boys. I am like old Mr. William Pollock of the Harbour Head. He is very old and has been ill for a long time, and one night last week he was so low that his daughter-in-law whispered to someone that she thought he was dead. Darn it, I ain't, he called right out, only, Miss Oliver dear, he did not use so mild a word as darn. Darn it, I ain't, and I don't mean to die until the Kaiser's well licked. Now that, Miss Oliver dear, concluded Susan, is the kind of spirit I admire. I admire it, but I can't emulate it, sighed Gertrude. Before this I have always been able to escape from the hard things of life for a little while by going into dreamland and coming back like a giant refreshed. But I can't escape from this. Nor I, said Mrs. Blythe. I hate going to bed now. All my life I've liked going to bed, to have a gay, mad, splendid half-hour of imagining things before sleeping. Now I imagine them still, but such different things. I am rather glad when the time comes to go to bed, said Miss Oliver. I like the darkness because I can be myself in it. I needn't smile or talk bravely. But sometimes my imagination gets out of hand too, and I see what you do. Terrible things. Terrible years to come. I am very thankful that I have never had any imagination to speak of, said Susan. I have been spared that. I see by this paper that the Crown Prince is killed again. Do you suppose there is any hope of his staying dead this time? And I also see that Woodrow Wilson is going to write another note. I wonder, concluded Susan, with the bitter irony she had of late begun to use when referring to the poor president, if that man schoolmaster is alive. In January, Jims was 5 months old, and Rilla celebrated the anniversary by shortening him. He weighs 14 pounds, she announced jubilantly, just exactly what he should weigh at 5 months, according to Morgan. There was no longer any doubt in anybody's mind that Jims was getting positively pretty. His little cheeks were round and firm and faintly pink. His eyes were big and bright. His tiny paws had dimples at the root of every finger. He had even begun to grow hair, much to Rilla's unspoken relief. There was a pale golden fuzz all over his head that was distinctly visible in some lights. He was a good infant, generally sleeping and digesting as Morgan decreed. Occasionally he smiled, but he had never laughed, in spite of all efforts to make him. This worried Rilla also, because Morgan said that babies usually laughed aloud from the 3rd to the 5th month. Jims was 5 months and had no notion of laughing. Why hadn't he? Wasn't he normal? One night Rilla came home late from a recruiting meeting at the Glen where she had been giving patriotic recitations. Rilla had never been willing to recite in public before. She was afraid of her tendency to lisp, which had a habit of reviving if she were doing anything that made her nervous. When she had first been asked to recite at the Upper Glen meeting she had refused. Then she began to worry over her refusal. Was it cowardly? What would Jem think if he knew? After 2 days of worry Rilla phoned to the president of the Patriotic Society and said that she would recite. She did, and lisped several times, and lay awake most of the night in an agony of wounded vanity. Then 2 days after she recited again at Harbour Head. She had been at Lowbridge and over harbour since then, and had become resigned to an occasional lisp. Nobody except herself seemed to mind it, and she was so earnest and appealing and shining-eyed. More than one recruit joined up because Rilla's eyes seemed to look right at him when she passionately demanded how could men die better than fighting for the ashes of their fathers in the temples of their gods, or assured her audience with thrilling intensity that one crowded hour of glorious life was worth an age without a name. Even stolid Miller Douglas was so fired one night that it took Mary Vance a good hour to talk him back to sense. Mary Vance said bitterly that if Rilla Blythe felt as bad as she had pretended to feel over Jem's going to the front, she wouldn't be urging other girls' brothers and friends to go. On this particular night Rilla was tired and cold and very thankful to creep into her warm nest and cuddle down between her blankets, though as usual with a sorrowful wonder how Jem and Jerry were faring. She was just getting warm and drowsy when Jim suddenly began to cry, and kept on crying. Rilla curled herself up in her bed and determined that she would let him cry. She had Morgan behind her for justification. Jim's was warm, physically comfortable, his cry wasn't the cry of pain, and had his little tummy as full as was good for him. Under such circumstances it would be simply spoiling him to fuss over him, and she wasn't going to do it. He could cry until he got good and tired and ready to go to sleep again. Then Rilla's imagination began to torment her. Suppose, she thought, I was a tiny, helpless creature only 5 months old, with my father somewhere in France and my poor little mother, who had been so worried about me, in the graveyard. Suppose I was lying in a basket in a big black room without one speck of light, and nobody within miles of me for all I could see or know. Suppose there wasn't a human being anywhere who loved me, for a father who had never seen me couldn't love me very much, especially when he had never written a word to or about me. Wouldn't I cry too? Wouldn't I feel just so lonely and forsaken and frightened that I'd have to cry? Rilla hopped out. She picked Jims out of his basket and took him into her own bed. His hands were cold, poor mite, but he had promptly ceased to cry. And then, as she held him close to her in the darkness, suddenly Jims laughed, a real, gurgly, chuckly, delighted, delightful laugh. "Oh, you dear little thing," exclaimed Rilla. "Are you so pleased at finding you're not all alone, lost in a huge, big, black room?" Then she knew she wanted to kiss him, and she did. She kissed his silky, scented little head, she kissed his chubby little cheek, she kissed his little cold hands. She wanted to squeeze him, to cuddle him, just as she used to squeeze and cuddle her kittens. Something delightful and yearning and brooding seemed to have taken possession of her. She had never felt like this before. In a few minutes Jims was sound asleep, and as Rilla listened to his soft, regular breathing and felt the little body warm and contented against her, she realized that, at last, she loved her war baby. "He has got to be such a darling," she thought drowsily as she drifted off to slumberland herself. In February Jem and Jerry and Robert Grant were in the trenches, and a little more tension and dread was added to the Ingleside life. In March, Ypres, as Susan called it, had come to have a bitter significance. The daily list of casualties had begun to appear in the papers, and no one at Ingleside ever answered the telephone without a horrible cold shrinking, for it might be the station master phoning up to say a telegram had come from overseas. No one at Ingleside ever got up in the morning without a sudden piercing wonder over what the day might bring. "And I used to welcome the morning so," thought Rilla. Yet the round of life and duty went steadily on, and every week or so one of the Glen lads who had just the other day been a rollicking schoolboy went into khaki. "It is bitter cold out tonight, Mrs. Dr. dear," said Susan, coming in out of the clear starlit crispness of the Canadian winter twilight. "I wonder if the boys in the trenches are warm." "How everything comes back to this war," cried Gertrude Oliver. "We can't get away from it, not even when we talk about the weather. I never go out these dark cold nights myself without thinking of the men in the trenches. Not only our men, but everybody's men. I would feel the same if there were nobody I knew at the front. When I snuggle down in my comfortable bed I am ashamed of being comfortable. It seems as if it were wicked of me to be so when many are not." "I saw Mrs. Meredith down at the store," said Susan, "and she tells me that they are really troubled over Bruce. He takes things so much to heart. He has cried himself to sleep for a week over the starving Belgians. 'Oh, Mother,' he will say to her, so beseeching like, 'surely the babies are never hungry. Oh, not the babies, Mother. Just say the babies are not hungry, Mother.' And she cannot say it because it would not be true, and she is at her wits' end. They try to keep such things from him, but he finds them out, and then they cannot comfort him. It breaks my heart to read about them myself, Mrs. Dr. dear, and I cannot console myself with the thought that the tales are not true. When I read a novel that makes me want to weep, I just say severely to myself, 'Now, Susan Baker, you know that is all a pack of lies.' But we must carry on. Jack Crawford says he is going to the war because he is tired of farming. I hope he will find it a pleasant change. And Mrs. Richard Elliott over harbour is worrying herself sick because she used to be always scolding her husband about smoking up the parlour curtains. Now that he has enlisted, she wishes she had never said a word to him. You know Josiah Cooper and William Daly, Mrs. Dr. dear? They used to be fast friends, but they quarrelled 20 years ago and have never spoken since. Well, the other day Josiah went to William and said, "Right out, let us be friends. 'Tain't any time to be holding grudges." William was real glad and held out his hand, and they sat down for a good talk, and in less than half an hour they had quarrelled again over how the war ought to be fought. Josiah holding that the Dardanelles expedition was rank folly, and William maintaining that it was the one sensible thing the Allies had done. And now they are madder at each other than ever, and William says Josiah is as bad a pro-German as Whiskers on the Moon. Whiskers on the Moon vows he is no pro-German, but calls himself a pacifist, whatever that may be. It is nothing proper, or Whiskers would not be it, and that you may tie to. He says that the big British victory at Neuve Chapelle cost more than it was worth, and he has forbid Joe Milgrave to come near the house because Joe ran up his father's flag when the news came. Have you noticed, Mrs. Dr. dear, that the Tsar has changed that Prish name to Przemysl, which proves that the man had good sense, Russian though he is? Joe Vickers told me in the store that he saw a very queer-looking thing in the sky tonight over Lowbridge way. Do you suppose it could have been a Zeppelin, Mrs. Dr. dear? I do not think it very likely, Susan. Well, I would feel easier about it if Whiskers on the Moon were not living in the glen. They say he was seen going through strange manoeuvres with a lantern in his backyard one night lately. Some people think he was signalling. To whom? Or what? Ah, that is the mystery, Mrs. Dr. dear. In my opinion, the government would do well to keep an eye on that man, if it does not want us to be all murdered in our beds some night. Now I shall just look over the papers a minute before going to write a letter to little Jem. 2 things I never did, Mrs. Dr. dear, were write letters and read politics. Yet here I am, doing both regular, and I find there is something in politics after all. Whatever Woodrow Wilson means I cannot fathom, but I am hoping I will puzzle it out yet. Susan, in her pursuit of Wilson and politics, presently came upon something that disturbed her, and exclaimed in a tone of bitter disappointment, "That devilish Kaiser has only a boil after all." "Don't swear, Susan," said Dr. Blythe, pulling a long face. "Devilish is not swearing, Dr. dear. I have always understood that swearing was taking the name of the Almighty in vain." "Well, it isn't refined," said the doctor, winking at Miss Oliver. "No, Dr. dear. The devil and the Kaiser, if so be that they are really 2 different people, are not refined, and you cannot refer to them in a refined way. So I abide by what I said, although you may notice that I am careful not to use such expressions when young Rilla is about. And I maintain that the papers have no right to say that the Kaiser has pneumonia and raise people's hopes, and then come out and say he has nothing but a boil. A boil, indeed. I wish he was covered with them." Susan stalked out to the kitchen and settled down to write to Jem, deeming him in need of some home comfort from certain passages in his letter that day. "We're in an old wine cellar tonight, Dad," he wrote, "in water to our knees, rats everywhere, no fire, a drizzling rain coming down, rather dismal, but it might be worse. I got Susan's box today and everything was in tip-top order and we had a feast. Jerry is up the line somewhere and he says the rations are rather worse than Aunt Martha's ditto used to be, but here they're not bad, only monotonous. Tell Susan I'd give a year's pay for a good batch of her monkey faces, but don't let that inspire her to send any, for they wouldn't keep. We have been under fire since the last week in February. One boy, he was a Nova Scotian, was killed right beside me yesterday. A shell burst near us and when the mess cleared away he was lying dead. Not mangled at all, he just looked a little startled. It was the first time I'd been close to anything like that and it was a nasty sensation, but one soon gets used to horrors here. We're in an absolutely different world. The only things that are the same are the stars, and they are never in their right places somehow. Tell Mother not to worry, I'm all right, fit as a fiddle, and glad I came. There's something across from us here that has got to be wiped out of the world, that's all, an emanation of evil that would otherwise poison life forever. It's got to be done, Dad, however long it takes, and whatever it costs, and you tell the Glen people this for me. They don't realize yet what it is has broken loose. I didn't when I first joined up. I thought it was fun. Well, it isn't. But I'm in the right place all right, make no mistake about that. When I saw what had been done here to homes and gardens and people, well, Dad, I seemed to see a gang of Huns marching through Rainbow Valley and the Glen and the garden at Ingleside. There were gardens over here, beautiful gardens with the beauty of centuries, and what are they now? Mangled, desecrated things. We're fighting to make those dear old places where we had played as children safe for other boys and girls, fighting for the preservation and safety of all sweet, wholesome things. Whenever any of you go to the station, be sure to give Dog Monday a double pat for me. Fancy the faithful little beggar waiting there for me like that. Honestly, Dad, on some of these dark, cold nights in the trenches, it heartens and braces me up no end to think that thousands of miles away at the old Glen station there is a small spotted dog sharing my vigil. Tell Rilla I'm glad her war baby is turning out so well, and tell Susan that I'm fighting a good fight against both Huns and cooties." "Mrs. Doctor, dear," whispered Susan solemnly, "what are cooties?" Mrs. Blythe whispered back, and then said in reply to Susan's horrified ejaculations, "It's always like that in the trenches, Susan." Susan shook her head and went away in grim silence to reopen a parcel she had sewed up for Jem and slip in a fine-tooth comb. Chapter 12. In the Days of Langemarck. "How can spring come and be beautiful in such a horror," wrote Rilla in her diary, "when the sun shines and the fluffy yellow catkins are coming out on the willow trees down by the brook, and the garden is beginning to be beautiful. I can't realize that such dreadful things are happening in Flanders. But they are. This past week has been terrible for us all, since the news came of the fighting round Ypres and the battles of Langemarck and St. Julien. Our Canadian boys have done splendidly. General French says they saved the situation when the Germans had all but broken through. But I can't feel pride or exultation or anything but a gnawing anxiety over Jem and Jerry and Mr. Grant. The casualty lists are coming out in the papers every day. Oh, there are so many of them. I can't bear to read them for fear I'd find Jem's name, for there have been cases where people have seen their boys' names in the casualty list before the official telegram came. As for the telephone, for a day or two I just refused to answer it, because I thought I could not endure the horrible moment that came between saying hello and hearing the response. That moment seemed 100 years long, for I was always dreading to hear, "There is a telegram for Dr. Blythe." Then, when I had shirked for a while, I was ashamed of leaving it all for Mother or Susan, and now I make myself go. But it never gets any easier. Gertrude teaches school and reads compositions and sets examination papers just as she always has done, but I know her thoughts are over in Flanders all the time. Her eyes haunt me. And Kenneth is in khaki now too. He has got a lieutenant's commission and expects to go overseas in midsummer, so he wrote me. There wasn't much else in the letter. He seemed to be thinking of nothing but going overseas. I shall not see him again before he goes. Perhaps I will never see him again. Sometimes I ask myself if that evening at Four Winds was all a dream. It might as well be. It seems as if it happened in another life, lived years ago, and everybody has forgotten it but me. Walter and Nan and Di came home last night from Redmond. When Walter stepped off the train, Dog Monday rushed to meet him, frantic with joy. I suppose he thought Jem would be there too. After the first moment he paid no attention to Walter and his pats, but just stood there, wagging his tail nervously and looking past Walter at the other people coming out, with eyes that made me choke up, for I couldn't help thinking that, for all we knew, Monday might never see Jem come off that train again. Then when all the people were out, Monday looked up at Walter, gave his hand a little lick as if to say, "I know it isn't your fault he didn't come. Excuse me for feeling disappointed." And then he trotted back to his shed, with that funny little sidelong waggle of his that always makes it seem that his hind legs are travelling directly away from the point at which his forelegs are aiming. We tried to coax him home with us. Di even got down and kissed him between the eyes and said, "Monday, old duck, won't you come with us just for the evening?" And Monday said he did. "I'm very sorry, but I can't. I've got a date to meet Jem here, you know, and there's a train goes through at 8. It's lovely to have Walter back again, though he seems quiet and sad, just as he was at Christmas. But I'm going to love him hard and cheer him up and make him laugh as he used to. It seems to me that every day of my life Walter means more to me." The other evening Susan happened to say that the Mayflowers were out in Rainbow Valley. I chanced to be looking at Mother when Susan spoke. Her face changed and she gave a queer little choked cry. Most of the time Mother is so spunky and gay you would never guess what she feels inside. But now and then some little thing is too much for her and we see under the surface. "Mayflowers," she said. "Jem brought me Mayflowers last year," and she got up and went out of the room. I would have rushed off to Rainbow Valley and brought her an armful of Mayflowers, but I knew that wasn't what she wanted. And after Walter got home last night he slipped away to the valley and brought Mother home all the Mayflowers he could find. Nobody had said a word to him about it. He just remembered himself that Jem used to bring Mother the first Mayflowers, and so he brought them in Jem's place. It shows how tender and thoughtful he is, and yet there are people who send him cruel letters. It seems strange that we can go on with ordinary life just as if nothing were happening overseas that concerned us, just as if any day might not bring us awful news. But we can and do. Susan is putting in the garden, and Mother and she are house cleaning, and we Junior Reds are getting up a concert in aid of the Belgians. We have been practicing for a month and having no end of trouble and bother with cranky people. Miranda Pryor promised to help with a dialogue, and when she had her part all learned, her father put his foot down and refused to allow her to help at all. I'm not blaming Miranda exactly, but I do think she might have a little more spunk sometimes. If she put her foot down once in a while, she might bring her father to terms, for she is all the housekeeper he has, and what would he do if she struck? If I were in Miranda's shoes, I'd find some way of managing Whiskers-on-the-Moon. I would horsewhip him or bite him if nothing else would serve. But Miranda is a meek and obedient daughter whose days should be long in the land. I couldn't get anyone else to take the part because nobody liked it, so finally I had to take it myself. Olive Kirk is on the concert committee and goes against me in every single thing. But I got my way in asking Mrs. Channing to come out from town and sing for us anyhow. She is a beautiful singer and will draw such a crowd that we will make more than we will have to pay her. Olive Kirk thought our local talent good enough, and Minnie Clow won't sing at all now in the choruses because she would be so nervous before Mrs. Channing. And Minnie is the only good alto we have. There are times when I am so exasperated that I feel tempted to wash my hands of the whole affair. But after I dance around my room a few times in sheer rage, I cool down and have another whack at it. Just at present I am racked with worry for fear the Isaac Reeses are taking whooping cough. They have all got a dreadful cold, and there are 5 of them who have important parts in the programme, and if they go and develop whooping cough, what shall I do? Dick Reese's violin solo is to be one of our titbits, and Kit Reese is in every tableau, and the 3 small girls have the cutest flag drill. I've been toiling for weeks to train them in it, and now it seems likely that all my trouble will go for nothing. Jim's cut his first tooth today. I am very glad, for he is nearly 9 months old, and Mary Vance has been insinuating that he is awfully backward about cutting his teeth. He has begun to creep, but doesn't crawl as most babies do. He trots about on all 4s and carries things in his mouth like a little dog. Nobody can say he isn't up to scheduled time in the matter of creeping, anyway. Way ahead of it, indeed, since 10 months is Morgan's average for creeping. He is so cute it will be a shame if his dad never sees him. His hair's coming on nicely, too, and I am not without hope that it will be curly. Just for a few minutes, while I've been writing of Jims and the concert, I've forgotten Ypres and the poison gas and the casualty list. Now it all rushes back, worse than ever. Oh, if we could just know that Jem is all right. I used to be so furious with Jem when he called me Spider, and now if he would just come whistling through the hall and call out, "Hello, Spider," as he used to, I would think it the loveliest name in the world. Rilla put away her diary and went out to the garden. The spring evening was very lovely. The long green, seaward-looking glen was filled with dusk, and beyond it were meadows of sunset. The harbour was radiant, purple here, azure there, opal elsewhere. The maple grove was beginning to be misty green. Rilla looked about her with wistful eyes. Who said that spring was the joy of the year? It was the heartbreak of the year. And the pale purply mornings and the daffodil stars and the wind in the old pine were so many separate pangs of the heartbreak. Would life ever be free from dread again? "It's good to see PEI twilight once more," said Walter, joining her. "I didn't really remember that the sea was so blue and the roads so red and the wood nooks so wild and fairy haunted. Yes, the fairies still abide here. I vow I could find scores of them under the violets in Rainbow Valley." Rilla was momentarily happy. This sounded like the Walter of yore. She hoped he was forgetting certain things that had troubled him. "And isn't the sky blue over Rainbow Valley?" she said, responding to his mood. "Blue, blue. You'd have to say blue 100 times before you could express how blue it is." Susan wandered by, her head tied up with a shawl, her hands full of garden implements. Doc, stealthy and wild-eyed, was shadowing her steps among the spirea bushes. "The sky may be blue," said Susan, "but that cat has been Hyde all day, so we will likely have rain tonight, and by the same token I have rheumatism in my shoulder." "It may rain, but don't think rheumatism, Susan. Think violets," said Walter gaily. Rather too gaily, Rilla thought. Susan considered him unsympathetic. "Indeed, Walter dear, I do not know what you mean by thinking violets," she responded stiffly, "and rheumatism is not a thing to be joked about, as you may some day realize for yourself. I hope I am not of the kind that is always complaining of their aches and pains, especially now when the news is so terrible. Rheumatism is bad enough, but I realize, and none better, that it is not to be compared to being gassed by the Huns." "Oh, my God, no!" exclaimed Walter passionately. He turned and went back to the house. Susan shook her head. She disapproved entirely of such ejaculations. "I hope he will not let his mother hear him talking like that," she thought as she stacked the hose and rake away. Rilla was standing among the budding daffodils with tear-filled eyes. Her evening was spoiled. She detested Susan, who had somehow hurt Walter. And Jem. Had Jem been gassed? Had he died in torture? "I can't endure the suspense any longer," said Rilla desperately. But she endured it as the others did for another week. Then a letter came from Jem. He was all right. "I've come through without a scratch, Dad. Don't know how I or any of us did it. You'll have seen all about it in the papers. I can't write of it. But the Huns haven't got through. They won't get through. Jerry was knocked stiff by a shell one time, but it was only the shock. He was all right in a few days. Grant is safe too." Nan had a letter from Jerry Meredith. "I came back to consciousness at dawn," he wrote. "Couldn't tell what had happened to me, but thought that I was done for. I was all alone and afraid, terribly afraid. Dead men were all around me, lying on the horrible grey slimy fields. I was woefully thirsty, and I thought of David and the Bethlehem water, and of the old spring in Rainbow Valley under the maples. I seemed to see it just before me, and you standing laughing on the other side of it, and I thought it was all over with me, and I didn't care. Honestly, I didn't care. I just felt a dreadful childish fear of loneliness and of those dead men around me, and a sort of wonder how this could have happened to me. Then they found me and carted me off, and before long I discovered that there wasn't really anything wrong with me. I'm going back to the trenches tomorrow. Every man is needed there that can be got. Laughter is gone out of the world, said Faith Meredith, who had come over to report on her letters. I remember telling old Mrs. Taylor long ago that the world was a world of laughter, but it isn't so any longer. It's a shriek of anguish, said Gertrude Oliver. We must keep a little laughter, girls, said Mrs. Blythe. A good laugh is as good as a prayer sometimes. Only sometimes, she added under her breath. She had found it very hard to laugh during the 3 weeks she had just lived through. She, Anne Blythe, to whom laughter had always come so easily and freshly. And what hurt most was that Rilla's laughter had grown so rare. Rilla, whom she used to think laughed overmuch. Was all the child's girlhood to be so clouded? Yet how strong and clever and womanly she was growing. How patiently she knitted and sewed and manipulated those uncertain junior reds, and how wonderful she was with Jims. She really could not do better for that child than if she had raised a baker's dozen, Mrs. Dr. dear, Susan had avowed solemnly. Little did I ever expect it of her on the day she landed here with that soup tureen.